The morning mist clung to the ancient Appalachian ridges like the breath of sleeping giants, weaving through towering oaks and pines that had witnessed centuries of human folly. In this primeval cathedral, where shafts of golden sunlight pierced the canopy to illuminate dancing particles of pollen and dust, Marcus Whitfield moved with the silent precision of a ghost. His weathered hands, scarred by 15 years of solitary survival, adjusted the leather strap of his hunting rifle as he navigated the moss-covered rocks that jutted from the forest floor like sleeping behemoths. The air here carried stories, the sweet perfume of wild honeysuckle mingling with the earthy musk of decomposing leaves, the distant smoke from his wood stove 30 miles deeper in the wilderness, and something else. Something that didn't belong. Marcus paused, his steel-grey eyes scanning the understory with an intensity that bordered on supernatural. At 42, he possessed the kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of hard-won wisdom and harder-lived experience. His dark hair, now streaked with premature silver, fell across a face carved by mountain winds and marked by the kind of solitude that either breaks a man or forges him into something unbreakable. The scent reached him again. Fear. Human fear. It was a smell he'd learned to recognize during his years as a state park ranger, before the incident that drove him into these woods like a wounded animal, seeking the darkness to heal. Before David. His breath caught in his throat as unwelcome memories threatened to surface, the laughter of a 6-year-old boy echoing through these very trees, small hands that trusted him completely, a wooden horse carved with loving patience during long winter nights. And then, the accident that wasn't an accident, though he wouldn't learn that truth for another 15 years. Marcus shook his head, forcing himself back to the present. The fear scent was growing stronger, carried on the mountain breeze that whispered warnings through the underbrush. His Cherokee blood he didn't even know was his, sang with an ancestral knowledge that something was terribly wrong in his sanctuary. He moved forward, his worn leather boots finding purchase on the damp earth with the unconscious grace of a man who'd spent half his life learning to read the forest's moods. Each step was deliberate, calculated to disturb nothing while missing nothing. This was his gift, this ability to become one with the wilderness that had raised him after civilization failed him so catastrophically. The cabin he'd left behind that morning was a testament to his chosen exile. Built with his own hands from trees felled on his 20-acre homestead, it breathed with the scent of cedar shavings and the black coffee that kept him company during sleepless nights. Animal pelts hung from hand-hewn beams, not trophies of conquest, but necessities of survival, each one taken with respect and gratitude. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth never cold, fed by wood. He split with the methodical rhythm of a man who understood that each swing of the axe was a meditation on endurance. But this morning, something had called him away from that sanctuary. An uneasiness that started in his chest and spread outward like ripples in a still pond. The same feeling he'd learned to trust during his ranger days, the one that had saved him from bear encounters and guided him to lost hikers more times than he could count. Now, as he moved deeper into the virgin forest, where even the hunting guides rarely ventured, that feeling intensified. The normal symphony of the woods, the distant drumming of a woodpecker, the rustle of squirrels in the canopy, the melodic trill of mountain songbirds, had fallen into an unnatural silence. Marcus crested a ridge and stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs with a rhythm that seemed to echo through the cathedral quiet of the ancient trees. Below, in a small clearing where wildflowers normally danced in the dappled sunlight, something that defied the natural order of his sanctuary waited for him. A child, a small boy, no more than 8 or 9, bound to the trunk of a massive oak with yellow rope that cut cruelly into his thin wrists. The boy's clothes, a red t-shirt and blue jeans that had once been clean, were torn and filthy, speaking of days spent in terror. His small face was streaked with tears and dirt, and when he looked up at Marcus's approach, 2 distinct eyes, One blue as a summer sky, one brown as rich earth, pleaded silently for salvation. The sight hit Marcus like a physical blow, driving all the air from his lungs in a rush that left him dizzy. For a moment that stretched into eternity, he was transported back 15 years to another clearing, another child, another moment when his failure to act quickly enough had cost an innocent life. But this child was alive, breathing, waiting. Marcus forced his legs to move, descending into the clearing with his hands raised, his voice soft and careful. "Hey there, little man. I'm here to help you, okay? Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." The boy didn't speak. He couldn't speak, Marcus realized as he saw the depth of trauma reflected in those mismatched eyes. But something else caught his attention as he knelt beside the child to examine the ropes. Clutched in the boy's free hand was a small wooden horse, carved with the kind of loving detail that spoke of long winter nights and patient hands. Marcus's world tilted sideways as he recognized the craftsmanship. The curve of the horse's neck, the careful attention to the mane, the initials carved into the base with the tip of his own hunting knife. M.W. Marcus Whitfield. This was impossible. This wooden horse had been buried with his son David 15 years ago, placed in small hands that would never again throw a ball or build a fort in these very woods. He'd carved it during the last winter of David's short life, working by lamplight, while his boy slept peacefully in the cabin's loft, dreaming of adventures they would never share. "Where?" Marcus's voice broke as he gently worked at the ropes binding the child. "Where did you get this?" The boy's eyes widened with something that might have been hope. He pointed toward town, toward the civilization Marcus had fled, toward the brother he'd left behind, toward secrets that lay buried beneath 15 years of guilt and self-imposed exile. As the ropes fell away and the child collapsed into his arms, Marcus felt the careful walls he'd built around his heart begin to crumble. The boy was real, warm, alive, and somehow connected to the greatest loss of his life. The wooden horse seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat where it pressed between them, a bridge between past and present, between the dead and the living, between the man Marcus had been and the man he was about to become again. The forest around them seemed to exhale, releasing a breath it had held for 15 years. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed once, sharp and mournful, as if announcing that the time for hiding was over. The Cathedral of Whispers had delivered its message, and Marcus Whitfield, tracker, hermit, broken father, would have to find the courage to step back into a world that had taken everything from him once before. But as he looked down at the traumatized child in his arms, at the impossible wooden horse that connected them across time and death, Marcus understood that some battles couldn't be fought from the safety of exile. Some truths demanded the courage to face the very darkness you'd spent years running from. The boy's small hand gripped his shirt with desperate strength, and Marcus made a promise that echoed through the ancient trees like a sacred vow. "I've got you now, little man. I've got you, and I'm never letting go again." He had no way of knowing, as he stood in that clearing holding a traumatized child and an impossible wooden horse, that he was about to uncover a conspiracy that reached back to his own stolen birth, forward to his murdered son, and deep into the heart of the family that had never truly been his family at all. The Cathedral of Whispers had kept its secrets long enough. Now it was time for truth. Marcus carried the boy through the forest with the careful tenderness of a man handling sacred relics. Each step toward his cabin was measured, deliberate, designed to disturb neither the child's fragile trust nor the ghosts that walked beside them through the dappled shadows. The wooden horse remained clutched in the boy's small fist, its familiar weight against Marcus's chest, feeling like a dagger made of memory and impossible hope. The cabin emerged from the trees like something born of the forest itself, its weathered logs silvered by decades of mountain weather. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney and the wide porch, built extra deep for David, though Marcus had never admitted that even to himself, welcomed them with the scent of cedar and the promise of sanctuary. Inside, Marcus settled the boy on the worn leather couch that faced the massive fireplace. The child's eyes, that impossible combination of sky and earth, took in the sparse but comfortable interior with the wariness of a creature that had learned not to trust shelter. Hand-carved furniture built to last generations, shelves lined with field guides and survival manuals, and on the mantel above the fire, a single photograph turned face down, too painful to display but too precious to discard. "Are you hungry, son?" Marcus asked, his voice rusty from disuse. The boy nodded slightly, still silent, still clutching the wooden horse. As Marcus moved to the small kitchen area, he felt 15 years of carefully constructed solitude cracking like ice in spring. He heated venison stew on the wood-burning stove, the familiar ritual grounding him as memories threatened to surface like fish rising to feed. The stew was David's favorite, though Marcus had never consciously admitted he still made it the same way, with extra carrots and just a touch of maple syrup to cut the gaminess. How many times had he stood in this exact spot, watching his son's face light up at the first taste? "Daddy, this is the best stew in the whole world." David's voice bright as morning sun through the cabin windows. "Can we have it every day?" Every day would make it ordinary, buddy. Special things are special because they're rare. If only he'd known how rare those moments truly were. How precious, how finite. Marcus shook his head, forcing himself back to the present. The boy was watching him with those mismatched eyes, and something in that gaze reminded him achingly of David's unwavering trust. Children, he'd learned, possessed an uncanny ability to see through pretense to the truth beneath. This boy saw something in Marcus that made him feel safe, despite whatever horrors had brought him to that tree. As they ate in comfortable silence, Marcus studied the wooden horse that the boy refused to release, even to hold his spoon properly. The craftsmanship was unmistakably his own. The way the mane flowed, the proud arch of the neck, the careful attention to proportion that had taken him weeks to perfect. But more than that, he could see the tiny imperfections that marked it as the specific horse he'd carved for David. A small nick in the left ear where his knife had slipped. A barely visible crack in the base where David had dropped it during a camping trip. And there, almost worn smooth by small hands, the initials MW carved with a father's love and a promise to always be there. But David was buried. Marcus had placed this horse in his son's hands himself, watched the small casket lowered into the ground at Hillside Cemetery, thrown the first handful of earth onto the polished wood with hands that shook like autumn leaves. How was it possible that this same horse now sat on his kitchen table, carried by another lost child who somehow needed to find him? After the boy had eaten, Marcus ran a warm bath in the cabin's single bathroom. The child submitted to being cleaned with the passive acceptance of someone who had learned not to resist anything, and Marcus's heart broke anew at the evidence of his ordeal. Rope burns on thin wrists, bruises in various stages of healing, the telltale signs of prolonged fear and inadequate care. But it was when Marcus was helping the boy into clean clothes, an old flannel shirt of David's that he'd never been able to discard, that he noticed something else. A small scar on the child's left shoulder, crescent-shaped and old enough to be barely visible. Marcus's blood turned to ice water as recognition hit him like a physical blow. "Daddy, look! I'm brave!" 5-year-old David, tumbling off his bicycle for the 10th time, this time catching his shoulder on the edge of a broken branch. The cut wasn't deep, but it bled enough to require stitches. Marcus had carried him to Dr. Reed's clinic, holding his son's hand while she carefully cleaned and sutured the wound. "You're going to have a little scar, sweetie," Dr. Reeds had said gently. "But scars are just proof that you were braver than whatever tried to hurt you." This boy had the same scar, in exactly the same place, the same crescent shape, the same faded silver color that spoke of childhood healing. Marcus sank into the chair beside the bed where the boy now lay, his mind reeling with possibilities that defied logic. Coincidence? Some cosmic joke played by a universe that had already taken everything that mattered, or something else. Something that suggested the impossible? "Who are you, little man?" he whispered, but the boy's eyes were already drifting closed, exhaustion finally claiming him. The wooden horse remained clutched against his chest like a talisman. As darkness settled over the forest, Marcus sat vigil beside the sleeping child, his mind churning through memories he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. The night David died flashed through his consciousness like lightning strikes. The frantic search through these same woods, the growing desperation as hours passed without a trace, the terrible moment when they found his son's broken body at the bottom of Miller's Gorge. "It was an accident," Coleman had said, his deputy's uniform crisp and authoritative, even in grief. "Kids wander off, get turned around. It happens in these woods." But Marcus had known these woods since childhood. David had known them too, had been raised to respect their dangers and navigate their moods. He would never have wandered alone to Miller's Gorge, would never have been careless enough to fall. Marcus had known it then, in his bones, in his heart, in the Cherokee blood that sang with ancestral wisdom he didn't yet understand. But grief had made him weak. Guilt had made him complicit in his own destruction. The official report called it accidental death, and Marcus had fled into the wilderness rather than fight the verdict that felt wrong in every fiber of his being. Now, watching this strange boy sleep with David's wooden horse, Marcus felt something stirring that he'd thought was dead forever. Purpose, determination, the need to protect innocence, even if he'd failed to protect his own. The fire crackled lower in the grate, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Outside, the night forest whispered its ancient secrets, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, mournful and knowing. Marcus reached for the photograph on the mantel, the one he'd kept face down for 15 years because looking at it was like swallowing glass. David's face smiled up at him from the frame, gap-toothed and radiant, holding the wooden horse with the same fierce possessiveness this strange boy had shown. Father and son at their last camping trip, 2 weeks before David's death, both of them unaware that time was running out like sand through an hourglass. "I don't know who you are, son," Marcus whispered to the sleeping child, "but somebody hurt you. Somebody took you from people who love you. And I swear on David's memory, I'm going to find out who and why." The wooden horse seemed to glow in the firelight, a bridge between past and present, between the living and the dead, between the man Marcus had been and the man he was about to remember how to be. Somewhere out there, in the world he'd fled, answers waited. Truth waited. Justice waited. And Marcus Whitfield, broken hermit and grieving father, was about to step back into the light to claim all three. What detail in Marcus's discovery of the boy has caught your attention the most? What moment made you feel the deepest connection to these characters? Share your thoughts below, because sometimes the stories that move us most are the ones that remind us of our own capacity for love and loss. The morning light filtered through the cabin windows like liquid gold, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air with lazy indifference to the turmoil brewing in Marcus's chest. The boy, Timothy, he'd learned through gentle coaxing and patient drawings, sat at the kitchen table, methodically eating oatmeal while clutching the wooden horse. His mismatched eyes held a wariness that spoke of horrors no child should witness, yet underneath the trauma, Marcus glimpsed something else. Intelligence, strength, a spark that reminded him achingly of David. Marcus had spent the sleepless night making a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. For 15 years he'd hidden in these mountains, nursing his grief like a wounded animal. But this child, this impossible connection to his lost son, demanded he face the world he'd fled, demanded he confront the brother who'd closed the book on David's death with suspicious efficiency. "Timothy," Marcus said gently, kneeling beside the boy's chair, "I need to take you to town, to find out who hurt you and make sure you're safe. But I want you to know, no matter what happens, I won't let anyone hurt you again. Do you understand?" The boy nodded solemnly, those extraordinary eyes holding a trust that both humbled and terrified Marcus. How many adults had failed this child? How many promises had been broken before a mountain hermit became his last hope? The drive into Millbrook felt like traveling through a time warp. Marcus's ancient pickup truck, held together by stubbornness and prayer, rattled down the mountain road, past landmarks that triggered memories like landmines. The old Miller place, where he and Coleman had learned to fish. The bend in the road, where their mother had died in a car accident 20 years ago, leaving 2 boys to raise themselves. The covered bridge, where David had thrown his first baseball. Each mile brought them closer to the pristine town square that Marcus hadn't seen in 15 years, and with it, the growing dread that this confrontation would change everything again. Millbrook's main street looked like a postcard of small-town America. White-columned courthouse gleaming in the morning sun, neat storefronts with hand-painted signs, flower boxes overflowing with late summer blooms. But Marcus's trained eye caught the subtle signs of decay beneath the facade. Boarded windows on the side streets, too many pawn shops, the hollow-eyed look of people carrying burdens heavier than their shoulders could bear. The sheriff's station sat at the corner of Main and Elm, its red brick exterior and polished brass nameplate projecting an authority that Marcus had once respected. Now, as he helped Timothy from the truck, that same authority felt oppressive, weighted with 15 years of unanswered questions. Deputy Rebecca Santos emerged from the station as they approached, her uniform crisp and her expression carefully neutral. Marcus remembered her as a rookie when he'd still worn the ranger badge, idealistic and eager to make a difference. Now she carried herself with the weary resignation of someone who'd learned that justice was more complicated than the academy had taught her. "Marcus Whitfield," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of surprise and something else. "Pity, fear. Heard you might be coming down from the mountain." "Rebecca." Marcus nodded, one hand resting protectively on Timothy's shoulder. "Found this boy tied to a tree up in the state forest. He's been missing for days, probably needs medical attention, and whoever did this to him is still out there." Rebecca's eyes softened as she looked at Timothy, and Marcus saw the idealistic rookie she'd once been flicker beneath the hardened deputy. "Sweet Jesus, come on, let's get him inside and—" "Santos!" The voice cracked across the morning air like a whip, and Marcus felt his entire body tense with recognition. Deputy Sheriff Coleman Whitfield emerged from the station, his uniform immaculate, his badge catching the sunlight like a signal mirror. At 45, Coleman had acquired the kind of authority that came from never being questioned, never being challenged, never being wrong. "Well, well," Coleman said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone that had driven Marcus into exile. "Little brother decides to rejoin civilization, bringing strays, I see." The years fell away like shed skin, and Marcus was 12 years old again, watching Coleman dismiss his concerns about the neighborhood bully with the same casual cruelty, watching him wave away Marcus's questions about their mother's accident with bureaucratic efficiency, watching him close David's case with suspicious speed and sealed records. "This boy was kidnapped, Coleman. He needs medical attention and a proper investigation." Coleman's eyes flicked to Timothy with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. Surprise? Recognition? Something that made the hair on Marcus's neck stand up with primitive warning. "Kidnapped?" Coleman laughed, but it sounded forced. "Brother, you've been living in the woods too long. Kid probably just wandered off, got himself turned around. Happens all the time up there. You should know that better than anyone." The words hit Marcus like a physical slap, their implication clear. "You should know about children dying in those woods. You let it happen before. This boy was tied up, Coleman, with rope, professionally done. This wasn't some kid getting lost. Rope burns, sure." Coleman stepped closer, and Marcus caught the scent of expensive cologne layered over something else. Sweat, the kind that came from fear, not exertion. Could be from trying to get himself free from brambles. Could be from falling. Hell, could be self-inflicted. Kids do strange things when they're scared and lost. Marcus felt rage building in his chest like pressure in a boiler. The same dismissive arrogance that had buried David's case was being deployed again, and this time Marcus wouldn't stand for it. Wouldn't run, wouldn't let another child become a statistic in Coleman's tidy reports. Look at him, Coleman. Really look at him. Does this look like a kid who wandered off and got lost? For a moment Coleman's mask slipped, and Marcus saw something flicker across his brother's face. Guilt, fear, recognition. But it was gone so quickly that Marcus wondered if he'd imagined it. "What I see," Coleman said slowly, "is my hermit brother, who's been living alone in the woods for 15 years, bringing in a traumatized child with some wild story about kidnapping. Makes me wonder, Marcus, what really happened up in those woods? What did you do to this boy?" The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Rebecca Santos stepped back unconsciously, her hand drifting toward her weapon. The few townspeople on the street stopped their conversations to stare, and Timothy, sweet, broken Timothy, pressed closer to Marcus with a whimper of pure terror. Marcus felt the world tilt sideways as he realized what his brother was doing, the careful positioning, the public location, the witnesses. Coleman wasn't just dismissing the case, he was setting up Marcus to take the fall for it. He's done this before, Marcus realized with crystalline clarity. David asked too many questions, saw too much. And Coleman, "I found this boy tied to a tree," Marcus said carefully, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street. "I brought him here because it was the right thing to do, because someone hurt him and that someone needs to be caught." Coleman's smile was cold as winter moonlight. "Of course you did, brother. Of course you did. Rebecca, why don't you take Mr. Whitfield and the boy inside, get their statements separately?" As they walked toward the station, Timothy's small hand found Marcus's, squeezing tight. In that grip, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility he'd carried for David, the promise he'd failed to keep, and the chance for redemption that had walked out of the forest into his life. Behind them, Coleman was already on his radio, his voice too low to hear, but his tone unmistakably that of a man covering his tracks. Marcus caught fragments. Unstable. Isolated too long. Need to be careful. The station's interior hit Marcus like a sensory assault. Fluorescent lights that turned everything the color of old bones, the smell of industrial disinfectant layered over decades of fear and desperation. The polished linoleum that reflected Coleman's badge like a mirror, creating an endless loop of authority that brooked no dissent. As they settled into the interview room, the same room where Marcus had given his statement about David's death 15 years ago, Timothy's grip on the wooden horse tightened until his knuckles turned white, and Marcus understood, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who'd learned to read sign in the wilderness, that they weren't here to report a crime. They were here to become suspects in one. If this story is drawing you in, if you're feeling the tension build between these brothers, hit that like button and subscribe to hear how this confrontation unfolds. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones wearing badges. The wooden horse sat on the metal table between them, innocent and impossible, holding secrets that could destroy a man who'd built his life on lies. And somewhere in the building, Coleman Whitfield was making phone calls, pulling strings, weaving the web that would either trap Marcus forever or finally give him the chance to expose the truth about his son's death. The collision of two worlds, the wilderness and civilization, justice and corruption, brother and brother, had begun, and only one would emerge intact. The interview room felt smaller with each passing moment, its institutional green walls pressing inward like the jaws of a trap. Marcus sat across from Rebecca Santos, watching her struggle between protocol and instinct as she prepared to take his statement. Timothy remained pressed against his side, the wooden horse clutched so tightly that Marcus worried the child's circulation might be cut off. Through the room's single window, Marcus could see Coleman pacing outside, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing with the sharp, aggressive movements of a man trying to control a situation that was spiraling beyond his grasp. Each gesture sent ripples of unease through Marcus's chest, the same primitive warning system that had kept him alive in the wilderness for 15 years. "Marcus," Rebecca began, her voice gentle but official, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened. From the beginning." Before Marcus could respond, the door burst open and Coleman strode in, his face flushed with barely controlled anger. Behind him followed a man Marcus didn't recognize, tall, expensively dressed with the kind of polished authority that spoke of courtrooms and closed-door deals. "Change of plans," Coleman announced. "Judge Blackwood wants to hear this personally. Harrison Blackwood." Marcus had heard the name whispered in the hunting lodges, where he occasionally picked up work. The judge who owned the lumber mill, who employed half the county, who played poker with the sheriff, and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. His presence here, for a simple missing child case, felt wrong on every level. "Your Honor," Rebecca stood quickly, clearly flustered by this breach of protocol. "I was just taking Mr. Whitfield's statement about the missing child." "Yes, well." Blackwood's voice carried the cultured tones of someone accustomed to being the smartest man in any room. "Given Mr. Whitfield's history with children in these woods, I thought it prudent to expedite matters." The words hit Marcus like a sledgehammer to the chest. History with children. They were painting him as a predator, using David's death as evidence of some kind of pattern. The careful orchestration of this moment, the public accusation, the judge's presence, Rebecca's obvious discomfort, spoke of a conspiracy that ran deeper than Marcus had imagined. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Marcus asked, his voice deadly quiet. Coleman leaned against the wall, his smile predatory. "I'm not suggesting anything, brother. I'm stating facts. 15 years ago, you were responsible for a child's safety. That child died. Now you show up with another traumatized child and another story about finding him in the woods. Pattern behavior, some might call it. David was my son." The words exploded from Marcus with the force of 15 years of suppressed rage. "He was my son, and you closed his case so fast the ink barely had time to dry. Your son who died because you weren't watching him carefully enough," Coleman shot back. "Your son who wandered off into dangerous terrain because his father was too busy playing mountain man to keep track of him." Timothy whimpered at the raised voices, pressing closer to Marcus. The sound cut through the anger like a knife, reminding Marcus that whatever game Coleman was playing, there was an innocent child caught in the middle of it. Judge Blackwood cleared his throat, the sound carrying the weight of legal authority. "Perhaps, Mr. Whitfield, you could explain how this child came to possess this particular toy." He gestured toward the wooden horse that Timothy clutched against his chest. Marcus felt the trap closing around him. How could he explain the impossible? How could he tell them that the horse had been buried with David without sounding like a madman? How could he make them understand that its presence here meant everything they'd been told about his son's death was a lie? "I carved that horse," Marcus said slowly, "for my son, 15 years ago. And you gave it to this boy when?" Blackwood's tone was professionally neutral, but his eyes gleamed with something that looked like triumph. "I didn't give it to him. He had it when I found him." Coleman laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Come on, Marcus, even you can do better than that. You expect us to believe this child just happened to have a toy that belonged to your dead son?" "It's the truth." "The truth," Blackwood interjected, "is often more complicated than it appears. Tell me, Mr. Whitfield, where exactly have you been living these past 15 years? "In the state forest. I have a homestead permit. 30 miles from civilization. No neighbors, no witnesses, no oversight." Blackwood's voice grew colder with each word. "Quite convenient for someone who might want to interact with children without being observed." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Marcus felt his world tilting sideways as he realized the depth of the conspiracy arrayed against him. They weren't just covering up Timothy's kidnapping. They were preparing to frame Marcus for it, to use David's death as evidence of a pattern that existed only in their fabricated narrative. But it was Timothy who broke the terrible silence. The boy suddenly lurched forward, his small hands scrabbling at the wooden horse's base. His thin fingers found a hidden mechanism that Marcus had forgotten existed, and with a soft click, the base of the horse opened like a tiny treasure chest. Inside the hollowed compartment, wrapped in plastic that looked far newer than the horse itself, was a small photograph. Rebecca Santos leaned forward, her training overriding the room's political dynamics. "What is that?" Timothy's hand shook as he extracted the photograph, but his mismatched eyes never left Marcus's face. The trust there was absolute, unshakable, the kind of faith that children offered only to those who'd proven themselves worthy of protection. Marcus took the photograph with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. The image was grainy, taken from a distance, but clear enough to identify the subjects. A man in a deputy sheriff's uniform leading a small boy by the hand toward a dark sedan. The man was Coleman, 15 years younger, but unmistakably recognizable. The boy was David. The photograph fell from Marcus's nerveless fingers like a stone into still water, and the ripples of its impact spread outward to shatter everything Coleman had built on lies and buried truth. In the sudden silence that followed, Marcus could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, could smell the acrid scent of fear sweat suddenly pouring from his brother's body. Coleman's face had gone the color of old bone. Judge Blackwood was staring at the photograph as if it were a snake that might strike. Rebecca Santos was reaching for her radio, her rookie idealism suddenly blazing like a torch in the institutional darkness. "Where?" Marcus's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Where did you get this?" Timothy pointed toward the door, toward the world outside, toward secrets that were finally clawing their way into the light. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke his first words since Marcus had found him. The lady said, "Give it to the man who lives with the trees." She said it would make the bad man pay. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, the collapse of carefully constructed lies. Marcus stared at the photograph of his brother leading David to his death and felt 15 years of guilt and self-imposed exile crumble into dust. Coleman was backing toward the door, his face a mask of panic barely held in check. Judge Blackwood was calculating angles, escape routes, damage control. Rebecca Santos was calling for backup, her voice sharp with the authority of someone who'd finally found a case worth fighting for. And Timothy, brave, broken Timothy, had given Marcus the key to justice that had been locked away for 15 years. The wooden horse sat open on the table like a Pandora's box, its secret finally revealed. And Marcus Whitfield, mountain hermit and grieving father, understood that the war for truth was just beginning. The photograph lay on the metal table like a piece of evidence from a crime scene frozen in time, its edges curled with age, but its damning clarity intact. Marcus stared at the image of his brother leading David toward what would become the boy's death, and felt the last 15 years of his life rearrange themselves into a new and terrible pattern. Coleman had stopped backing toward the door, his face cycling through emotions like a broken kaleidoscope: panic, rage, calculation, the look of a cornered animal weighing its options for survival. That's not what it looks like," Coleman stammered, but his voice carried none of its usual authority. "I was helping him. David was lost and I found him, and I was taking him back to where?" Marcus's voice was deadly quiet. "To whom? Because according to your report, David was found dead at the bottom of Miller's Gorge, alone, after an accidental fall that you investigated for exactly 48 hours before closing the case." Rebecca Santos stepped between the brothers, one hand resting on her service weapon. "Deputy Whitfield, I need you to step back and let me handle this." "Handle what?" Coleman's mask was slipping, revealing the desperate man beneath. "Handle some wild conspiracy theory based on an old photograph that could have been taken anywhere, any time. Rebecca, you know me. You know I would never... I know you closed a child's death investigation without interviewing key witnesses," Rebecca shot back. her rookie idealism blazing like a torch. "I know you sealed the records and refused to let the family see the autopsy report. I know because I pulled the file yesterday." The admission hit the room like a thunderclap. Marcus turned to stare at the young deputy, seeing her clearly for the first time, the careful way she'd positioned herself. The backup she'd called before the photograph was revealed, the file folder tucked under her arm that he hadn't noticed before. "You've been investigating David's death?" Rebecca nodded grimly. "For 2 years, ever since I found the first discrepancies in the missing children reports. Timothy Brennan isn't the first child to disappear in this county, Mr. Whitfield. He's just the first one lucky enough to be found alive." Judge Blackwood finally found his voice, his legal training reasserting itself even as his world crumbled. "Detective Santos, you're operating outside your jurisdiction and beyond your authority. This investigation is about to become federal jurisdiction." A new voice interrupted from the doorway. Dr. Evelyn Reeds stepped into the room with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades dealing with trauma and its aftermath. Behind her stood a man Marcus didn't recognize, tall, lean, with the kind of stillness that spoke of federal training. "Dr. Reeds!" Marcus rose instinctively, pulled by the gravity of the woman who'd been more mother to him than anyone since his own had died. "What are you doing here?" "What I should have done 15 years ago," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "Agent Morrison, FBI. He's been working with me to document what we now know is a systematic pattern of child trafficking operating out of this county." Agent Morrison stepped forward, his credentials already in his hand. "Marcus Whitfield, I understand you found Timothy Brennan tied to a tree in the state forest." "I did. And this photograph was concealed in a toy that belonged to your deceased son." "It was." Morrison turned to Coleman, who had gone the color of old parchment. "Deputy Sheriff Whitfield, you're under arrest for the murder of David Whitfield and the kidnapping of Timothy Brennan. You have the right to remain silent." "Wait!" Coleman's voice cracked like a whip. "You can't. You don't understand. This isn't what it looks like. I never hurt David. I was trying to protect him." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire everyone could smell, but no one could see. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the knot of guilt he'd carried for 15 years. Protect him from what? Coleman's eyes darted to Judge Blackwood, who was backing toward the window with the measured steps of a man calculating the distance to the ground. From them, from the people who were buying the children. David saw something he shouldn't have seen. He was asking questions. They wanted to silence him. "So you did it for them," Dr. Reed said, her voice heavy with the weight of professional disappointment. "You killed a 6-year-old boy to protect a trafficking ring." "No." Coleman's composure finally shattered completely. "I was supposed to scare him, make him stop asking questions. But he fought me, tried to run, and he fell. It was an accident. I swear on our mother's grave, Marcus, it was an accident." Marcus stared at his brother. The man who'd raised him after their mother died, who'd taught him to throw a baseball and drive a truck and be a man, and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. The Coleman he'd known, the brother he'd looked up to, had never existed, had been a carefully constructed lie designed to hide a monster. "But you covered it up," Marcus said quietly. "You made it look like David wandered off on his own. You sealed the records. You let me believe it was my fault. I had to protect the family name. Protect you. If the truth came out, dozens of children might still be alive," Agent Morrison interrupted. "Dr. Reeds, would you please share what you've discovered?" Dr. Reeds opened a thick file folder, her hands shaking slightly with emotion. "I've been documenting suspicious child disappearances in this county for over 20 years. Children from broken homes, single-parent families, foster care, all closed cases, all ruled runaways or accidents. All signed off on by Deputy Sheriff Whitfield and Judge Blackwood." She spread photographs across the table. School pictures of smiling children whose eyes would never see another birthday. Marcus recognized some of them from missing person posters that had peppered the county for years before quietly disappearing. Elena Brennan, Timothy's mother, was a social worker who stumbled onto the pattern, Dr. Reeds continued. She'd been investigating irregularities in the adoption system when she discovered that several of these missing children had been processed through fake adoption papers signed by Judge Blackwood. She was getting close to the truth when she disappeared. Timothy whimpered at the mention of his mother, and Marcus instinctively pulled the boy closer. "Is she alive?" Agent Morrison confirmed. "In federal protective custody. She managed to escape and contacted the FBI, but not before hiding evidence that would expose the entire operation. Evidence she entrusted to her son." Marcus looked down at Timothy, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not just a traumatized child, but a brave little soldier who'd carried the weight of justice in his small hands, who'd trusted a mountain hermit to help him complete his mother's mission. "The wooden horse," Marcus said suddenly. "Elena dug up David's grave." "She did, Doctor." Reeds confirmed. "She knew from her research that David's death was connected to the trafficking ring. She found the photograph in your cabin's ruins." "My cabin burned?" 3 months ago, Rebecca Santos said quietly. "Ruled electrical fire. But now we know it was arson. They were trying to destroy any evidence that might connect David to the trafficking operation." Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as 15 years of carefully constructed reality crumbled into dust. His cabin, the sanctuary he'd built with his own hands, filled with memories of David, was gone, burned by the same people who'd killed his son to cover their tracks. But as he looked around the room, at Timothy's trusting face, at Dr. Reed's fierce determination, at Agent Morrison's professional competence, at Rebecca Santos's righteous anger, Marcus understood that some things couldn't be destroyed by fire or buried by lies. Truth had a way of surviving, of waiting, of finding the right moment to emerge from the shadows and demand justice. Judge Blackwood was pressed against the window now, his expensive suit wrinkled with sweat. Coleman sat slumped in his chair, the weight of decades of lies finally breaking his shoulders. And Timothy, brave Timothy, had given them the key to unlock a conspiracy that had claimed God knows how many innocent lives. The wooden horse sat open on the table, its secret finally revealed, its purpose finally fulfilled. David's last gift to his father, carried across 15 years and delivered by a boy who'd never known him, but had trusted in the power of truth to set things right. The unraveling had begun, and Marcus Whitfield, mountain hermit and grieving father, was finally going to see justice for his son. The federal agents who flooded into the sheriff's station moved with the efficient precision of a military operation. Judge Blackwood never made it to the window. Agent Morrison's partner intercepted him with handcuffs that clicked shut like the closing of a tomb. Coleman sat motionless in his chair, staring at his hands as if trying to understand how they'd become instruments of such betrayal. Marcus held Timothy close as chaos swirled around them, feeling like the eye of a hurricane where strange calm prevailed amid the destruction of everything he'd thought he knew about his life. "Doctor," Reeds approached them with the careful movements of someone navigating emotional landmines. "Marcus," she said gently, "there's more you need to know about yourself, about why you were able to find Timothy when dozens of search teams couldn't." She opened another folder, this one containing documents that looked older, more fragile. Birth certificates, adoption papers, medical records that spoke of a different kind of theft than what Coleman and Blackwood had perpetrated. "You weren't born a Whitfield, Marcus. Coleman found you when you were 3 days old, abandoned at the county hospital by a teenage mother who couldn't care for you. But instead of processing you through the legal system," Dr. Reeds paused, her voice heavy with the weight of another 15-year-old secret. "Instead of following protocol, he took you home, told everyone you were his baby brother, that your mother had died in childbirth." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each revelation rearranging his understanding of himself, his family, his entire existence. "That's impossible. I remember our mother. You remember Frances Whitfield, who loved you like a son," Dr. Reed said gently. "But she wasn't your birth mother. Your birth mother was Sarah Crow Feather, a 17-year-old Cherokee girl who'd been living on the streets. She came to the hospital alone, gave birth alone, and made the hardest decision a mother can make. Marcus felt the world spinning beneath his feet. Cherokee. The tracking abilities he'd never questioned, the way the forest spoke to him in languages older than words, the instinctive knowledge that had kept him alive in the wilderness. It all made sudden, crystalline sense. She's still alive, Dr. Reeds continued softly, living on the reservation in North Carolina. She never stopped looking for the son who was stolen from her through an illegal adoption that Coleman facilitated even as a rookie deputy. Timothy stirred in Marcus's arms, and when Marcus looked down, the boy's mismatched eyes held understanding beyond his years. This child had carried the truth of Marcus's stolen birth, along with everything else, waiting for the right moment to deliver all of it into the light. "How long have you known?" Marcus asked Dr. Reed. "I suspected from the beginning. You had none of the Whitfield features, none of their mannerisms. But Francis loved you so much, and Coleman insisted on the story, and—" She shrugged helplessly. "I was young. I thought keeping the family together was more important than questioning how it came to be." Agent Morrison approached with a phone in his hand, his expression grim but determined. "Mr. Whitfield, we need to discuss what happens next. Coleman is talking, trying to negotiate a plea deal. He's giving us names, locations, the entire structure of the trafficking operation, but there's something else." He handed Marcus the phone, and a woman's voice came through the speaker. Melodic, warm, carrying the cadence of someone who'd spent years speaking in a language that predated English on this continent. "Marcus, my son, is it really you?" The voice hit him like lightning, awakening something in his DNA that recognized its origin. Somewhere in the deepest part of his genetic memory, a 3-day-old infant remembered this voice, these tones, the rhythm of a heartbeat he'd known before birth. Marcus's voice broke like a teenager's. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything, little hawk. Just breathe. Just know that I never stopped looking, never stopped believing you were alive somewhere, learning to fly." Little hawk. The nickname hit him with the force of recovered memory, and Marcus suddenly understood why he'd never felt completely at home anywhere except in the wilderness. He'd been searching for the place his soul belonged, the land his ancestors had walked, the heritage that had been stolen along with his identity. Timothy tugged on Marcus's shirt, pointing to the window where news vans were gathering like vultures. The story was breaking across every channel. Corruption in small-town America, a trafficking ring that had operated for decades, children whose deaths had been covered up to protect monsters wearing badges. But it was Coleman's voice, small and broken, that cut through the chaos. "Marcus, brother, I know you'll never forgive me. I know what I did to David, what I did to you, what I did to all those families, but I need you to know. When I brought you home, when I told everyone you were my brother, that was the only good thing I ever did, the only thing I'm not ashamed of." Marcus turned to look at the man who'd raised him, who'd taught him right from wrong while living a life of systematic evil. The contradiction was too large to process, too complex to reconcile. "You killed my son," Marcus said quietly. "I did, and I'll live with that until the day I die. But David wasn't just your son, Marcus. He was my nephew, and I loved him. When he started asking questions about the missing children, when he said he'd seen me with one of them, I thought I could scare him into staying quiet. I never meant for him to fall, never meant—" "But you covered it up anyway." Coleman nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I was in too deep by then. The gambling debts, the people I owed money to, they owned me. They owned Blackwood. We were trapped in something that started with good intentions and became the theft of innocent lives," Agent Morrison finished coldly. "Mr. Whitfield, your brother's cooperation will be taken into account during sentencing, but he's looking at life in prison without parole. Judge Blackwood is facing the same charges, plus racketeering and conspiracy." Marcus nodded, feeling nothing but emptiness where anger should have been. Justice was coming, but it wouldn't bring David back, wouldn't restore the 15 years he'd lost to guilt and isolation, wouldn't heal the fractures in his soul that had been created by living a lie since birth. But as Timothy snuggled closer, as Dr. Reed squeezed his shoulder with maternal affection, as his birth mother's voice continued to flow through the phone like healing water over ancient stones, Marcus understood that some fractures could become sources of strength. The wooden horse sat on the table, its secret chamber empty now, its purpose fulfilled. David's last gift had delivered justice, exposed truth, and somehow, impossibly, reunited a stolen son with his birth mother. The boy he'd failed to protect had become the bridge that led him home to himself. Coleman was led away in handcuffs, his shoulders bent with the weight of confession. Judge Blackwood followed, his empire of false authority crumbling into federal charges and inevitable imprisonment. The sheriff's station that had been the seat of their power became the scene of their downfall, and Marcus Whitfield, Cherokee foundling, grieving father, mountain hermit, stood in the wreckage of everything he'd thought he knew about himself and felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. Hope. Hope that the truth could heal even the deepest wounds. Hope that justice, however delayed, could still arrive. Hope that a man could lose everything and somehow find more than he'd ever known he was missing. Timothy looked up at him with those extraordinary mismatched eyes and smiled for the first time since Marcus had found him. And in that smile, Marcus saw David's face, his birth mother's heritage, Dr. Reed's fierce love, and the promise that some stories, even the darkest ones, could still find their way to light. The collapse was complete. The false kings had fallen. And from their ashes, truth was finally free to rise. 3 weeks after the arrests that shook Millbrook to its foundations, Marcus stood on the porch of Dr. Reed's clinic, watching the town transform before his eyes. The revelation of the trafficking conspiracy had sent shockwaves through every corner of the community, creating ripples that touched lives in ways both profound and unexpected. Timothy sat beside him on the porch swing, no longer the silent, traumatized child Marcus had found tied to a tree. The boy's voice had returned gradually, like a spring emerging from beneath winter snow, and with it came stories that helped federal investigators piece together the full scope of the operation that had stolen so many innocents. "Mr. Marcus," Timothy said, his small hand still maintaining its grip on the wooden horse, though now it was carried more as a talisman than a lifeline. "Do you think my mama will like the mountains when she gets here?" Marcus smiled, the expression feeling foreign, but increasingly familiar on a face that had forgotten how to show joy. "I think she'll love them, Timothy, just like you do." Elena Brennan was being released from federal protective custody that afternoon, her courage in documenting and exposing the trafficking ring having finally borne fruit. The reunion between mother and son would happen in Dr. Reed's clinic, in the safe space the doctor had created for healing trauma and rebuilding shattered trust. Through the clinic's windows, Marcus could see the evidence of how truth's emergence had changed everything. The waiting room, once sparsely populated, now overflowed with families seeking help. Parents whose children had been labeled runaways were demanding new investigations. Foster families who'd unwittingly participated in illegal adoptions were seeking counseling and legal guidance. The community that had lived under a shadow of corruption for decades was finally stepping into the light. Dr. Reeds emerged from the clinic, her silver hair catching the afternoon sun like spun metal. At 67, she carried herself with the energy of someone half her age, energized by the vindication of suspicions she'd harbored for 20 years. "The families are ready," she announced, settling into the rocking chair that had become her command post for coordinating the healing process. 16 children recovered from illegal placements. 8 families reunited with sons and daughters they thought were lost forever. And more coming home every day as the FBI follows the paper trail. Marcus nodded, still struggling to process the magnitude of what Timothy's rescue had unleashed. The photograph hidden in David's wooden horse had been just the beginning. Coleman's cooperation had led to the discovery of detailed records, names, dates, financial transactions, photographs, documenting every child who'd passed through their operation. "What about the adoptive families?" Marcus asked. "The ones who thought they were getting children legally." Dr. Reed's expression softened with the compassion that had made her a legend in pediatric psychiatry. "That's the heartbreaking part. Most of them genuinely believed they were giving homes to orphans and abandoned children. Judge Blackwood's falsified documents were so convincing that even legal experts were fooled. Now they're facing the loss of children they've raised and loved, sometimes for years. It was a complexity Marcus hadn't anticipated, the web of victims that extended far beyond the stolen children themselves. Adoptive parents who'd built their lives around children they'd have to surrender. Siblings who'd grown up together now being separated. Grandparents who'd loved and spoiled children who weren't legally their grandchildren. Some of them are working with the birth families to maintain relationships," Dr. Reeds continued, "trying to create extended families that honor both the bonds of blood and the bonds of love. It's messy and complicated and beautiful in its own way." Timothy's attention was caught by a familiar figure walking up the clinic's front path. Rebecca Santos approached in civilian clothes, having requested a transfer to the FBI's task force investigating trafficking networks across Appalachia. The young deputy had become the face of the investigation, her idealism and determination inspiring others to come forward with information. "Mr. Whitfield," Rebecca said, settling on the porch steps, "I wanted to update you on the latest developments." She opened a folder that had become as familiar as family to Marcus over the past 3 weeks. Inside were photographs, documents and testimonials that painted a picture of systematic evil operating under the guise of law enforcement and judicial authority. 43 children total, Rebecca reported. "That's what we've documented so far across 5 counties. Coleman and Blackwood's operation was larger than we initially realized. They had connections to trafficking rings in Atlanta, Charlotte, even as far as Miami. Your son David wasn't their first victim, Mr. Whitfield. He wasn't even their youngest." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, but he'd learned to absorb them without breaking. Each revelation about the scope of Coleman's crimes felt like another nail in the coffin of the brother he'd thought he knew, but also like another step toward justice for all the families who'd suffered. "What about the financial side?" Dr. Reeds asked. "That's where it gets interesting," Rebecca said, her voice taking on the edge of someone who'd discovered just how deep corruption could run. Judge Blackwood's lumber mill was just the front. The real money was coming from wealthy clients who were willing to pay premium prices for children with specific characteristics. Blonde hair, blue eyes, particular ethnicities. They were treating human beings like catalog orders. Timothy shifted closer to Marcus, and Marcus automatically wrapped a protective arm around the boy's shoulders. The casual evil of treating children as commodities was something his mind still struggled to process, even after 3 weeks of revelations. "The good news," Rebecca continued, "is that the money trail is helping us track down every family involved. We're seizing assets, freezing accounts, following every dollar back to its source. Some of these wealthy adoptive parents are going to find themselves facing federal charges for human trafficking." Through the clinic's windows, Marcus could see Dr. Reeds's staff preparing for Eleanor Brennan's arrival. Balloons and welcome signs created by Timothy with help from other children in the clinic's care. The boy had thrown himself into the preparation with the kind of focused energy that came from anticipating the return of the most important person in his world. "There's something else," Rebecca said, her voice dropping to a more personal tone. "Something about your heritage, Mr. Whitfield. The FBI's genealogy specialist has been working with your birth mother to piece together your family tree." She handed Marcus a thick envelope that felt heavy with possibility. Inside were documents, photographs, and family trees that stretched back generations. Images of Cherokee ancestors who'd walked these mountains long before European settlers arrived. Stories of resistance and survival, of culture preserved despite systematic attempts at erasure. Your great-great-grandfather was Joseph Crow Feather, Rebecca explained. He was one of the Cherokee who hid in these mountains during the removal, helping others escape the Trail of Tears. Your family has been connected to this land for centuries, Mr. Whitfield. What you thought was an inexplicable connection to the wilderness is actually the call of ancestral memory. Marcus stared at a photograph of Joseph Crow Feather, a man whose eyes held the same intensity Marcus saw in his own mirror, whose posture suggested the same comfort in wild places that had defined Marcus's entire adult life. The man who'd saved lives by knowing every secret path through these mountains, every hidden valley where families could survive until the danger passed. Your birth mother wants to meet you, Rebecca said gently. Not today. She understands that Elena and Timothy's reunion needs to be their moment, but soon. She's been waiting 39 years to hold her son again. Timothy tugged on Marcus's sleeve, pointing toward the road where a dark sedan was approaching. Elena Brennan, finally free, finally safe, finally coming home to the child who'd carried the weight of justice in his small hands. Mr. Marcus, Timothy whispered, his voice bright with excitement and nervousness. Will you stay? Will you be here when Mama comes? Marcus looked at the boy who'd changed everything, who'd carried David's final gift across 15 years and delivered justice to a family that had given up hope, who'd trusted a mountain hermit to help him complete his mother's mission, who'd somehow become the bridge between Marcus's lost past and his uncertain future. I'll stay, Timothy, for as long as you need me. The sedan pulled into the clinic's parking lot, and through its windows, Marcus could see a woman whose face bore the same determined strength that had helped her son survive 6 days of captivity. Elena Brennan stepped out of the car with the careful movements of someone who'd learned that freedom was precious and fragile. Timothy launched himself from the porch with the explosive joy of a child whose world was finally being made whole again. The reunion happened in the clinic's parking lot, with mother and son colliding in an embrace that spoke of love, tested by separation, and proven unbreakable. Marcus watched from the porch, feeling his own tears flow freely for the first time in 15 years. The ripple effect of truth had touched every life in Millbrook, but perhaps none more profoundly than his own. He'd entered the forest that morning as a broken hermit carrying 15 years of guilt. He was emerging as a man reconnected to his heritage, his purpose, and his capacity for love. The wooden horse sat on the porch rail beside him, its secret chamber empty, but its mission complete. David's final gift had delivered justice, exposed truth, and somehow created a family from the wreckage of loss. The ripples were still spreading, would continue spreading for years to come, but Marcus Whitfield, Cherokee foundling, grieving father, reluctant hero, was finally ready to ride them home. 1 year later, the morning mist rolled off the mountains like the breath of ancestors welcoming the dawn, and Marcus Whitfield stood at the edge of his new world, watching Timothy race through the meadow with the unburdened joy of a child who'd learned that safety could be permanent. The boys' laughter echoed across the valley where Marcus had built their new home, not the isolated cabin of a hermit, but a real house where healing could happen and families could grow. The structure itself told the story of transformation. Built with Cherokee traditional techniques his newly discovered relatives had taught him, it breathed with the rhythm of the land, while offering modern comforts for Elena and Timothy. Solar panels glinted on the metal roof, and a wraparound porch provided space for the constant stream of visitors who'd become part of their extended family. Elena emerged from the kitchen, carrying 2 cups of coffee that steamed in the cool mountain air. At 34, she possessed the kind of beauty that came from surviving hell and choosing to trust in goodness anyway. The past year had restored the color to her cheeks and the confidence to her step, but more importantly, it had allowed her to watch her son heal from trauma that might have broken a lesser spirit. He's getting faster, she observed, settling beside Marcus on the porch swing he'd built with his own hands. Pretty soon, he'll be out running you on those morning hikes. Marcus smiled, the expression as natural now as breathing. That's the point. Boys are supposed to surpass their fathers. It means we did something right. The word hung in the air between them. Fathers, not biological, not legal, but real in every way that mattered. Over the past year, Marcus had discovered that family wasn't just about blood connections or shared DNA. It was about showing up, staying present, choosing love even when love was complicated. Through the meadow, Timothy was now chasing a butterfly with the determined focus he brought to everything. The boy who'd once been mute with trauma now chattered constantly, filling their home with questions, observations, and the kind of wonder that reminded adults why life was worth living. The wooden horse traveled with him everywhere, no longer a repository of secrets, but a tangible connection to the man who'd carved it with love and lost everything before finding it again. "Dr. Reed's called this morning," Elena said, her voice carrying news that had become routine over the past year. 3 more families reunited yesterday, sisters in Virginia, brothers in Tennessee, and a little girl in Kentucky who'd been missing for 4 years. The ripples continued spreading. Coleman's cooperation and Judge Blackwood's detailed records had exposed trafficking networks across the Southeast, leading to the rescue of children and the destruction of operations that had thrived in darkness for decades. The FBI had established a permanent task force headquartered in Millbrook, transforming the sleepy mountain town into an unlikely center for fighting child trafficking. Marcus pulled Elena closer, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. Their relationship had grown slowly, carefully, built on shared trauma and mutual respect before blooming into something deeper. 2 broken people learning to trust again, creating safety for Timothy while discovering their own capacity for healing. "What about the Hendersons?" Marcus asked, referring to one of the adoptive families struggling with the aftermath of the revelations. They'd raised a boy named Michael for 6 years, believing he was legally adopted, only to discover he'd been stolen from a teenage mother in Alabama. "They're all moving to Birmingham together," Elena reported. Michael's birth mother and the Hendersons worked it out. Shared custody, extended family, everyone focused on what's best for Michael rather than who has legal rights. It's messy and complicated, but it's working. It was one of many creative solutions that had emerged from the wreckage of the trafficking operation. Families refusing to be defined by the lies that had shaped their formation, choosing instead to create new structures based on love and the best interests of the children caught in the middle. Timothy came racing back toward the porch, his face flushed with exertion and happiness. "Mr. Marcus! Mama! The butterfly had rainbow wings! It was the most beautiful thing I ever saw." "More beautiful than your mama," Marcus teased, and Timothy giggled with the pure joy of a child who knew he was loved beyond measure. "Nothing's more beautiful than Mama," Timothy declared with absolute certainty. But the butterfly was second most beautiful. "Duh!" Elena laughed, the sound filling Marcus with the kind of contentment he'd thought was lost forever. These moments, simple, ordinary, precious beyond description, were what he'd been fighting for without knowing it. Not just justice for David, though that had come. Not just the truth about his heritage, though that had been transformative. But this, the daily miracle of family, freely chosen and fiercely protected. "Timothy," Elena said gently, "why don't you go wash up? Your grandmother Sarah will be here soon, and you know she likes to see clean hands." Timothy nodded eagerly and raced inside. Sarah Crowfeather's weekly visits had become the highlight of his schedule, partly because she always brought homemade bread, and partly because she told the best stories about Cherokee warriors and talking animals. But mostly because she looked at him with the same fierce love she'd shown Marcus from the moment of their reunion, the love of someone who understood that family was about choosing to stay, not about who shared your blood. "How are you handling the book interviews?" Eleanor asked as Timothy's footsteps thundered up the stairs. Marcus groaned softly. The publishing offers had started arriving 6 months ago, when the full scope of the trafficking operation became public knowledge. Publishers wanted the story of the mountain hermit who'd exposed corruption and found his heritage. Producers wanted movie rights, Journalists wanted exclusive interviews about growing up Cherokee without knowing it, about losing a son and finding a family. "I told them all the same thing," Marcus said. "This isn't my story to sell. It belongs to all the families who suffered, all the children who were stolen. If there's a book, the proceeds go to Dr. Reed's Foundation for Trauma Counseling." The foundation had become Elena's passion project, using the skills she'd developed as a social worker to create a network of support for families impacted by trafficking. Children who'd been recovered needed specialized therapy. Birth families needed help navigating reunification. Adoptive families needed counseling to process their own trauma and loss. The work was difficult, sometimes heartbreaking, but essential. A familiar truck turned into their driveway, and Marcus smiled as he recognized Dr. Reed's behind the wheel. At 68, she showed no signs of slowing down, dividing her time between the clinic in Millbrook and speaking engagements across the country about recognizing and combating child trafficking. "Uncle Marcus, Aunt Elena," Timothy's voice carried from his bedroom window. "Dr. Grandma is here." The titles had evolved organically over the past year. Dr. Reed's had become Dr. Grandma. Sarah Crowfeather was Grandmother Sarah. Elena was Mama, of course, but also Aunt Elena when Timothy was feeling playful. And Marcus was Uncle Marcus, and Mr. Marcus, and sometimes in quiet moments just Daddy. Though Timothy seemed to save that word for times when he felt especially safe and loved. Dr. Reed's climbed the porch steps with the energy of someone half her age, carrying a manila envelope that had become as familiar as family photos. More updates, more reunions, more evidence that truth had the power to heal even the deepest wounds. "Sarah will be here in 20 minutes, she announced, settling into the rocking chair that had migrated from her clinic porch to theirs. "She's bringing half the reservation with her, apparently. Your cousin James finished his master's degree in environmental science, and your cousin Maria's youngest just learned to walk." Family celebration. The extended Cherokee family had embraced Marcus with the enthusiasm of people who understood that finding lost relatives was cause for joy, not questions. They'd taught him the language his infant ears had heard before Coleman stole him away. They'd shared stories of ancestors who'd walked these mountains and hidden in their valleys. They'd helped him understand that his instinctive connection to the wilderness wasn't mystical. It was memory, genetic and cultural, calling him home. "There's something else," Dr. Reed said, her tone shifting to the professional cadence that meant important news. Rebecca called from Atlanta. They found him. Marcus didn't need to ask who. For the past year, one name had remained at the top of the FBI's most wanted list: Vincent Carrera, the Miami-based broker who'd coordinated the trafficking network's financial operations, the man who'd treated children like commodities and families like inventory, the architect of systematic evil who'd managed to disappear when the arrests began. Where? Costa Rica, living under a false identity, running a new operation with local partners. He thought he was untouchable. Dr. Reed's smile was sharp as justice. He underestimated how far the FBI was willing to reach. Elena squeezed Marcus's hand, understanding the significance without needing explanation. Carrera's capture meant the last major figure in the trafficking network was finally in custody. It meant that families could stop looking over their shoulders, stop worrying that the people who'd stolen their children might try again. Timothy burst through the front door like a small hurricane, his face and hands scrubbed clean and his hair combed with the careful precision of someone trying to make a good impression. Is grandmother Sarah really bringing the whole reservation? Dr. Reeds laughed. Maybe not the whole reservation, sweetie, but definitely enough cousins to keep you busy. Through the valley, dust clouds announced the arrival of multiple vehicles. Sarah Crowfeather's extended family approached like a caravan of celebration, bringing the kind of joy that could only come from people who understood that every gathering was precious, every reunion was sacred, every child was a gift to be protected. Marcus stood, helping Elena to her feet, watching their son race toward the arriving vehicles with arms spread wide like he was trying to hug the entire world. And maybe he was. Maybe that's what children did when they felt safe. They expanded, they embraced, they trusted that love was big enough to include everyone who mattered. The wooden horse sat on the porch rail, catching the morning sun like polished amber. David's final gift. Timothy's brave burden, the key that had unlocked truth and justice and healing. Marcus touched it gently, feeling his son's presence in the carved wood, his love in the careful craftsmanship, his forgiveness in the miracle of what the horse had made possible. "Thank you," he whispered to the mountains, to the ancestors, to the boy who died too young but had somehow managed to save so many others. "Thank you for bringing us home." Sarah Crow Feather emerged from the lead vehicle, her silver hair braided with colored ribbons and her face radiant with the joy of grandmotherhood. Behind her came cousins and second cousins, children and adults, all carrying dishes for the feast that would inevitably emerge whenever Cherokee families gathered. Timothy launched himself into Sarah's arms with the confidence of a child who knew he was cherished. Elena moved to welcome the arriving guests. Dr. Reeds began organizing the chaos with the efficiency of someone who'd spent a lifetime managing complex family dynamics. And Marcus stood on his porch, surrounded by the family he'd never known he was searching for, watching his chosen son embrace the heritage that connected them all to something larger than themselves. The legacy wasn't just about the children who'd been saved or the criminals who'd been brought to justice. It was about this, the daily miracle of love choosing to stay, of families refusing to be defined by the trauma that had shaped them, of healing that happened one day, one choice, one embrace at a time. The little hawk had learned to fly again, and the mountains that had sheltered him through his darkest years now witnessed his joy as he soared with the family that had always been waiting for him to come home. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the peaks, promising afternoon rain that would nourish the earth and feed the streams that carried stories down from the high places. And Marcus Whitfield, Cherokee foundling, grieving father, reluctant hero, chosen family patriarch, smiled and went inside to help prepare a feast worthy of the love that had saved them all. The wooden horse would sit on the porch rail through the rain, through the seasons, through the years to come. A guardian of memory, a keeper of promises, a reminder that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the deepest pain, and sometimes the longest journeys lead us exactly where we were always meant to be.